In this video, I am going to describe the different types of transport across a membrane and what passes through the plasma membrane easily. So the plasma membrane is selectively permeable, as I'm sure many of you have heard. Selectively. And essentially what that means is it allows some substances through a lot easier than other substances. For example, fats, gases, and certain other nutrients in easier than, for example, big proteins or big molecules of glucose. And so what you need to know is there's two types of transport: passive and active. And so essentially the difference is passive, there is no ATP being used, while active, ATP is directly being used. And if you ever are asked the question, is this passive or active, you have to consider, is ATP directly being used? That would make it active. Otherwise, it's considered passive. And active transport also requires a carrier protein. And you can imagine the carrier protein essentially as the shuttle that transports this stuff. And so, just for you to get an idea of what passes through the membrane easily, things that pass through very easily are gases and very small, uncharged, polar substances, essentially meaning fats. Sorry, polar does not mean fats. It's just polar substances have... It's essentially a molecule where one atom pulls electrons more than others. Now let's get into the types of passive transport. Let me erase this. And so, one type of passive transport is diffusion. And diffusion is the net movement of molecules, more specifically of solute particles, down a concentration gradient. And so essentially what it's saying is, imagine you take a drop of fruit coloring and drop it into a cup of water. And so at first where it's dropped is going to be very concentrated, and so eventually you see the color begin to spread out, and that's an example of diffusion. It's just going from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration, which is the same thing as net movement of solute down the concentration gradient. But you have to remember, molecules will move the other way, but overall the net movement is towards the lower concentration. And how fast diffusion occurs is affected by many factors. So let me clear this and I'll list them. Number one is the distance. So obviously the more the particles have to travel, the slower it's going to take. Common sense. The size of the gradient. So imagine you spray a lot of perfume in one area. It's gonna go and spread out a lot quicker than if you spray one spray of perfume in the air. Also, molecular size. So as you can imagine, heavier things move slower, right? That's the same for diffusion. If you have heavier solute particles, which solute is dissolved in the solvent, then it's going to diffuse slower. And then there's temperature. And so as you increase the temperature, particles vibrate and move faster and faster. So at a higher temperature, diffusion will occur faster. And eventually, diffusion will stop. Well, the net change stops, and then eventually the solute concentration will be equal. Will be uniform is a better word. And in the next video, I'll discuss osmosis and other types of transport. But I didn't want to make this video too long.